When Obama was running for president, there were a lot of Jews who said, "Oh, there's so many Jews in his inner circle, everything will be fine." Then when he got elected, they said, "Oh, look, there's a minion in the White House or in the cabinet." Well, it doesn't always work out so well that Jews, just because they're Jews, turn out to be friends of the Jews. We read down the story in the Torah about Joseph being what we call a court Jew. He was the second most powerful guy in all of Egypt. Pharaoh appointed him to be in charge of all food distribution. And since that time, there have been Jews in high places throughout the history. They haven't always served the best interests of the Jewish people. Of course, there's arguments as to what that is, but I think there's enough examples to show that you can't always just assume because they're Jewish things will go well. For example, we have three justices, Jewish justices on the Supreme Court of the United States right now, but there's a lot of conservatives, right center people, who would rather have none of them on the Supreme Court because they're so liberal. Depends on where you sit. But let me give you a few examples. First of all, we have the story, this goes back in Jewish history, to the time of Hanukkah. Now, most people would say that the main problem with Hanukkah was that Antiochus, the Syrian Greek king, in 167 BCE, put all these interdictions prohibiting Jewish behavior, which caused the Maccabees to rebel. But there's a very famous story about a historian named Elias Bickerman, who was one of the great historians of the 20th century. And I remember in rabbinical school reading a book that we were assigned to read that he wrote in 1937. It was called The God of the Maccabees. And when he agrees that Antiochus Epiphanes IV supported the introduction of Greek customs, such as naked athletic practice and the worship of idols. Now that unleashed a revolution, but Bickerman argued he did not do this because he wanted to change the way Jews lived. That was not normal Seleucid policy. Rather, he accepted an invitation that came to him from the wealthiest and most influential of the Jews themselves, who wanted to make their people cosmopolitan. When the Maccabees resisted him, they were preserving Judaism from an internal, not an external threat. Now, that theory has provoked criticism, but no one's come up with a better theory. And so still today we have a lot of Jews who need to protect Judaism from internal and not external threats. I'll give you a whole bunch of examples. One of the most famous Jews in Jewish history as a court Jew is Henry Kissinger. Now, a lot of people said, "Oh, Kissinger, he's a German Jew, knows the Holocaust intimately, he'll be a great Secretary of State, and we have nothing to worry about with Nixon." Well, there's an article that came out recently when they disclosed new tapes of Nixon, who has said the following in a tape that just came out, conversation from 40 years ago. Quote, "If they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern," Kissinger is heard saying on the latest batch of Nixon-era Oval Office tapes released by the Nixon Library. Now, Kissinger said, "Oh, you got to understand in historical context, I was trying to save Soviet Jewry," but here's what he said. "If they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern." Now, how can you ever possibly forgive a guy for saying something like that? And you think back to around the Holocaust, just 20 years before Kissinger said that, when 400 rabbis were going to Washington to try and compel to talk to Roosevelt about bombing Auschwitz and about stopping the Nazis, and Stephen Weiss put a stop to it by telling Roosevelt not to go see these, not to pay any attention to these hordes. And you can see how one guy could do so much damage if he's high up in the administration. Or there's a story in the book called Chutzpah by Professor Alan Dershowitz, where he talks about how a Polish clergyman escaped from a concentration camp, and he got to Washington, and they brought him to one of the Jewish justices, Frankfurter, who was so close to the president at that time, and Frankfurter heard the story, trying to prevail upon him to go to the president to intercede, to do more. Frankfurter said, according to the book Chutzpah, I don't believe him, and even if I did, I wouldn't use my political capital to go to the president for that regard. So we see many examples like that in history. Now, what do we have today? Well, you've also got when Israel was fighting for recognition in the 20s and 30s and 40s, there was something called the American Council of Judaism, a left-wing American group of Jews who were not Zionistic or anti-Zionistic, as was the Reform movement in the beginning. Now, of course, it's a Zionist movement. And today on the far right in Judaism, we have Jews who are against the existence of the State of Israel. So just saying you're Jewish doesn't mean necessarily you're going to help the Jewish cause. And we've got various left-wing fringe groups today who claim to be pro-peace, pro-Israel, like J Street, who are actually doing significant damage. There's 52 Jewish organizations in the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, including Peace Now, but they won't let J Street in because that's how far left J Street is. And so I think as we think about all of that, we have to understand that just because there's going to be Jews around a powerful figure doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be for the good. I went to a luncheon this week sponsored by CUFI, Christians United for Israel. They're evangelical Christians, fundamentalists. It was an organization started by a pastor named John Hagee. Most Jews are nervous about these people. They think they all want to convert us. But that group has 500,000 members already, and they're organizing like AIPAC is in every congressional district, and their only goal is to love Jews, not to convert us, but to help Israel. And I'd much rather have them defending Israel's back than some of these left-wing groups of Jews. So I think the bottom line point is simply this. Jews shouldn't get so excited when there are Jews in positions of power because they might do us more harm than good. And it's an important lesson to remember when we read the story of Joseph as being one of the most powerful men in all the world, and we hear the story about the Maccabees. Really, it was a war among Jews, as Bickerman seems to have proven in 1937, more than just attacking the great powers. And if the wealthy Jews had not urged and supported Antiochus and encouraged him to hurt Judaism, there would have never been a war in the first place. Things would have been much better. Although it ended up having independence, religious independence and freedom for 100 years, which was fantastic. But how many Jews died? And would there have been independence? In any case, probably not. So in some ways we say, looking at hindsight, that was a valuable and important rebellion, and it certainly set the stage for other rebellions. But can't forget the fact that it was ultimately some of the high-powered Jews who betrayed the interests of the Jewish people. Shalom.